So the opportunistic fungal infections are essentially the organisms that do take advantage of the human body when it's immunocompromised or it has a low immunity or yeah, well that basically the same or just cannot function as well. So the most important and common one is the Candida albicans, and the reason for that is because it's already inside the human body normally. But what happens if the person gets immunocompromised or uses a medication for too long, then it will proliferate and start to cause problems. So alba means white, and it's found in it's dimorphic, so it's found in two forms in nature. One at two different temperature degrees. So under 20 Celsius, then it looks like as pseudohypha and budding yeasts, while in the human body where the temperature is 37 Celsius normally, then it would create germ tubes. The infection could be systemic, like within the whole body, or superficial fungal infection. It causes oral and esophageal thrush in immunocompromised patients. So if we have a neonate, like a really newborn baby, or patient who uses a lot of steroid for a really long time, and diabetic patients with AIDS, they all have an immunocompromisation, so they're also susceptible to have oral or esophageal thrush because, as we said, the candida is already there in the mouth. And this is the image for the oral thrush. There you go. It's this white grayish thing all over the mouth. It can also cause vulvovaginitis in a female because it's already a part of the normal flora of the vagina. So if if that female is diabetic, or if she uses antibiotics, what happens with antibiotics is that it would kill the normal flora. So that would give the Candida albicans more space to proliferate and cause problem. It also can cause diaper rash in babies and infective endocarditis, especially in people who do drugs, because it goes into their systemic circulation, and the first valve to encounter in the heart is the tricuspid valve, so that causes infective endocarditis. Also, it can cause disseminated candidiasis, especially in neutropenic patients. Also, chronic mucocutaneous candidiasis. So, mucocutaneous could be chronic as well. The treatment is oral fluconazole or topical azoles if it was vaginal infection, then nystatines, azoles, or rarely sometimes we can use quinacandines for the oral infection, while if we encounter an esophageal or a systemic disease, both of these, we can use fluconazole, echinocandins, or amphotericin B. So that's for Candida albicans. Then for Aspergillus fumigatus, it is a septate hyphae that branch at 45 degree acute angle, which basically means that when it branches into different parts, then the angle between each part and the other is less than 90. So it's an acute angle. It nearly equals 45 degree, and that's important to differentiate the Aspergillus fumigatus from other fungi. It causes invasive aspergillosis, and that's the most dangerous disease that it can cause. It happens in immunocompromised patients, especially in those with neutrophil dysfunction, just like chronic granulomatous disease. And the reason for that is because this Aspergillus fumigatus is catalase positive. So, and these patients, unfortunately, who lack neutrophil or they do have neutrophil dysfunction, just like CGD patients, they are unable to fight this aspergillus. It can also cause aspergillomas, like in E. Okay, so first about the acute angle, then if we take a look at D, this is the Aspergillus fumigatus, and these branches have this narrow angle between each one and the other one because it's less than 90, so it's kind of 45 degree. It's acute angle. But then we were talking about the aspergillomas as in E. So let's say that this is an aspergilloma, and the area around it, surrounding it, is just not clear. Okay. So it's in a pre-existing lung cavities. This is something that we can see in patients who already had TB or tuberculosis. So they already have some cavitations in their lungs, and what happens is that a few of these fungi do accumulate in these cavities, and they also move with the gravity. So if the patient is standing up, they would settle down at the bottom of this cavity. If he lays down, then they will spread throughout the whole cavity. So that's how they look like. Aspergillomas basically are the fungi filling a pre-existing cavity in the lung. Some species of Aspergillus, some of those Aspergillus fungi, some species produce a toxin called aflatoxin, and it is associated with hepatocellular carcinoma. The treatment for this Aspergillus fumigatus are voriconazole or echinocandins. Voriconazole and echinocandins, that's the second line. It can also cause a third disease, that is allergic bronchopulmonary aspergillosis, and it's basically a hypersensitivity in response to aspergillus growing in the lung mucus. So what happens is that the body gets really sensitized due to this aspergillus attaching and living in the lung mucus, and this is type 1 hypersensitivity. It's associated with asthma and cystic fibrosis patients. It may cause bronchiectasis and eosinophilia as well. So for the third fungi, it's the Cryptococcus neoformans. It's 5 to 10 micrometers size and narrow budding. It's heavily encapsulated, that yeast. So the important part about it is that the capsule it contains is really, really thick. So it's heavy encapsulated. It's not dimorphic, so it's only present in one shape, and it stains with the PAS, that is the periodic acid skiff stain. It's found in soil and also in mm, penguins droppings. Even though it's found in soils and penguins droppings, but it for the human it gets to the lungs through inhalation. So somebody takes in the air that has the spores within it. But within the body, it goes into hematogenous dissemination to the meninges. Okay, this can be highlighted by the India ink, which will show clear halo. So as in F over here, the India ink is the black base or the black color, and then this bright kind of green is the fungi, but the important part about it is the halo around it. It's this clear halo around each one of those fungi, so that's why it looks special under the India ink. It can also stain with the mucicarmine, and that is the red color, red inner capsule, just like in G. So here is a deep red color of the inner capsule. Then we have another test for that is more sensitive and more specific other than the microscopy and culture. It's the latex agglutination test. It works on the polysaccharides capsule antigen. So we know that the thick capsule it was heavily encapsulated. So the thick capsule have a repeating sequence of polysaccharides, and this is what the latex agglutination test can detect. The Cryptococcus neoformans can cause a cryptococcosis, which can manifest with meningitis, pneumonia, and encephalitis. So if a patient has meningitis and pneumonia and as well as symptoms of fungal infection, then we should think of Cryptococcus neoformans. On the imaging, it may look like a soap bubble in the brain, soap bubble lesion in the brain, and it happens primarily like most importantly in immunocompromised patients. The treatment is amphotericin B plus flucytosine. It is followed by that, so both of these are together at first. Okay, amphotericin B plus flucytosine, and then by time you can add the fluconazole, that is for cryptococcal meningitis. Okay. Now, for the other infection, that is the mucor and rhizopa species, it's irregular, broad, non-septate hyphae branching at a wide angle. So this is a differentiating point, as in H over here, because the angle between each branch and the other one is kind of large. So it may even be 90 degrees, for example, or even more. So basically, that's an important thing to know, is that it branches at wide angles. It causes a mucormycosis. There's an R over here. So mucormycosis, mostly in patients with DKA and neutropenia. Um, these fungi, they just love the glucose and also the ketone bodies, and that's a great media if the patient is diabetic and having the AKA, that's diabetic ketoacidosis. So that's a great media and environment for its proliferation. And also if a patient has neutropenia as well, just like a patient with leukemia, that's a great condition for the mucormycosis to develop. The spores, of course, we can take them by inhalation. That's when the fungi proliferate in blood vessel walls and penetrate the cribriform plate and enter the brain. So basically, the cribriform plate is the base of the skull, and the base of the skull has a few openings, allowing the cranial nerves to pass from into the brain and the face and the body and everything. So what these fungi are able of doing is they can just flow through these openings and go up into the brain and enter the brain. So now we have rhinocerebral frontal lobe abscess. So we can check the brain and see that we're having a newly formed abscess. We can also develop cavernous sinus thrombosis, and the patient may suffer from headache, facial pain, a black necrotic eschar on the face as an eye. So this black thing is the black necrotic tissue. This may have a cranial nerve involvement, of course, because it's going along the nerves into the brain, which means they may end up hurting these nerves, and the patient ends up with nerve dysfunction or nerve involvement. So the treatment is just like any other necrotic tissue, the surgical debridement, that's one, and second, amphotericin B or isovuconazole. So that's for this page, and then we have Pneumocystis jirovecii. It causes Pneumocystis pneumonia. Okay, Pneumocystis pneumonia is a diffuse interstitial pneumonia, as in A. So if we take a look at the chest X-ray over here, like both lungs are just filled with abnormality. So it's a yeast-like fungus. Originally was classified as a protozoan. Most infections are asymptomatic. So even though we can see this on X-ray, but the patient doesn't necessarily have a lot of symptoms, so it can be asymptomatic. It happens in immunocompression, just like patients with AIDS. So if patient is having AIDS, then it would predispose him to this disease of pneumocystis pneumonia. It looks diffuse bilateral ground glass opacities on chest imaging with pneumatoceles, just like in B. So here we go, pneumatoceles, and then surrounded by a lot of ground glass appearance on chest imaging. This is diagnosed by bronchoalveolar lavage or lung biopsy, but of course the bronchoalveolar lavage is much easier to do and fast. So it's disc-shaped, just like over here, disc-shaped yeast seen on methanamine silver stain of lung tissue, or with fluorescent antibodies. So basically we can add a fluorescent dye to the antibodies, and antibodies should normally attach to these fungi, and that's how we can see them. The treatment is the TMP SMX, and that's the name of Bactrim. It's basically a trimethoprim with methoxazole. Okay, so that's one. Or we can also use pentamide or dapsone. Dapsone can be used alone as single agent just as a prophylaxis, okay? But it also can be used as a treatment for the disease if it was used in combination with trimethoprim. We can also use atovaquone, and we can start prophylaxis if the patient even does not have these symptoms. But just let's say we are having a patient who has HIV, and then we check his blood and see that the CD4 cell count drops to less than 200 cells per millimeter, which means, okay, so CD4 is less than 200 cells. Okay, so 200 and above doesn't necessarily require prophylaxis, but if it's less than 200 CD4 cells, then we should start the prophylaxis even if the patient does not have the symptoms of such disease yet. Okay, so now we move on to the last opportunistic fungi, because we've been talking only about opportunistic fungi that take advantage of the human body, and that is the Sporothrix schenckii. Okay, Sporothrix schenckii. It causes sporotrichosis. That's the name of the disease. It's dimorphic fungus, which means it exists in two shapes in nature. So it either looks like a cigar, so cigar-shaped yeast within the human body that is at a temperature of 37 Celsius, and then it looks like hyphae with spores in soil, and that is conidia. Conidia, that's a nice name. Okay, it lives on vegetation when spores are traumatically introduced into the skin, typically by a thorn. So this disease can be called, named actually, rose gardener's disease, because it happens to people who would get the infection through working at their gardens, like with flowers. So they get hurt, they get injured, and that infection moves to their skin, and it would cause local pustule first or ulcer, and then it starts creating nodules along the draining of the lymphatics. So if it happens in the hand, as over here, then the nodules and progression will go up through the whole hand and the body and everything. So it goes along the draining lymphatics. That's why it's called ascending lymphangitis. It's a disseminated disease. It's possible in immunocompromised patients. So it could be only at one place, or it may disseminate depending on the immunity of the host, and that is the human body. The treatment is itraconazole or potassium iodide. That the potassium iodide is only for cutaneous or lymphocutaneous infection. So in order to memorize it, we think of a rose gardener who smokes a cigar in a pot. And that's it for the opportunistic fungi.